أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أمسينا وأمسى الملك لله والحمد لله لا شريك له لا إله إلا هو وإليه المصير أمسينا على فطرة الإسلام وكلمة الإخلاص وعلى دين نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى ملة أبينا إبراهيم حنيفا وما كان من المشركين اللهم إني أمسيت منك في نعمة وعافية وستر فأتم علي نعمتك وعافيتك وسترك في الدنيا والآخرة اللهم ما أمسى بي من نعمة أو بأحد من خلقك فمنك وحدك لا شريك لك فلك الحمد ولك الشكر يا رب لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك وعظيم سلطانك رضينا بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم نبيا ورسولا ثم أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome back to the Friday night lecture. Still going through the Fiqh of Janazah. And tonight we will continue our series of lectures and we will start from As-Sunnatu fi Bina'i al-Maqabir. What is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ when it comes to building or making the grave? Building or making the grave. Now we're talking about the burial took place and then we put the dirt in the grave. To what extent, how high the grave should be raised. السنة أن يرفع القبر عن الأرض قدر شبر ليعرف أنه قبر. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is to raise the grave about shibr. Shibr is one open full hand like this. This is shibr. So we're talking about like this. Why? ليعرف أنه قبر. To be distinguished, to be known that this is a grave. To be known that this is a grave. ويحرم رفعه زيادة على ذلك. And it is prohibited to raise the grave more than one shibr. It is muharram, it is prohibited to raise it more than that. And this is according to hadith that was narrated by Imam Muslim and others. أن ثمامة said قال كنا مع فضالة بن عبيد بأرض الروم. We were with فضالة ibn Ubayd in the land of the Romans. فتوفي صاحب لنا. Someone from our group passed away. فأمر فضالة بن عبيد بقبره فسوي. So they flattened the grave. And then he said, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يأمر بتسويتها. I have heard the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم commanding us to flatten the grave. قال الإمام الترمذي رحمه الله والعمل على هذا عند بعض أهل العلم. Some of the people of knowledge, some of the scholars, they said the sunnah is to flatten the grave, not even to raise any part of it. يكرهون أن يرفع القبر فوق الأرض إلا بقدر ما يعرف أنه قبر. The scholars, they disliked karaha. They disliked for the grave to be raised above the ground more than it is distinguished. So a sunnah is to flatten the grave. But if we are afraid that people might not distinguish, might not know that this is a grave, then it is okay to raise the grave up to shibr, but no more than that. So some of the scholars, they said the sunnah is to flatten the grave, and some of them said it's okay to raise the grave a little bit. What's the reason? What's the purpose for that? So people may know and can distinguish that this is a grave, so they don't step on it. So they don't step on it. لكي لا يوطأ ولا يجلس عليه. So people cannot step on it or sit on it, even though we're going to talk about this. Imam al-Shawkani rahimahullah, one of the great scholars, he said, وَالظَّاهِرُ أَنَّ رَفْعَ الْقُبُورِ زِيَادَ عَلَى الْقَدْرِ الْمَأْذُونِ فِيهِ مُحَرَّمٌ. So it appears that raising the grave more than what is permissible, which is shibr, it is prohibited. Raising the grave more than this, it is prohibited. ومن رفع القبور الداخل تحت الحديث دخولا أوليا القباب. And part of what we are talking about, the prohibition of raising the grave more than one shibr, is building, like a dome. Building a room with a dome, so that grave becomes a place, like a shrine that people visit and spend time in it and all that stuff. So this is not permissible in Islam. It's not permissible to make the grave as a shrine so people will come and visit that place, to build on it like a building or a room or something like this. So again, the bottom line here is that the grave should be distinguished, should be known. If it is easy to distinguish the grave, then it's better to flatten the grave. If it's not easy and people might not know that this is a grave, so they might step on it or sit on it, then it is okay, the sunnah, to raise the grave up to shibr, so people will know that this is a grave. Now, تسنيم القبر وتسطيحه. تسنيم. The word tasneem is from sanam. The back of the camel? We call it a sanam. Okay? So tasneem al-qabr means to put the dirt going like a pyramid. Okay? Not a square, but this is the grave. So to put the dirt going up like a pyramid. Okay? Versus tasṭīḥ, flatten, like sath. Okay? اتفق الفقهاء على جواز تسنيم القبر وتسطيحه. So it is both are permissible. Both are permissible. Whether to put the dirt in a shape of a pyramid, in one condition, that the top of the grave cannot exceed, shibr, or to flatten the grave, نقل عن القاضي عياض رحمه الله أن أكثر أهل العلم قالوا أن الأفضل تسنيمها. Qadi Iyad, one of the great scholars, he said that the people of knowledge, the majority of the people of knowledge, they said it is better of tasneem al-qabr, to put the dirt, in a shape or a form of a pyramid, to be distinguished. And in many places in the Muslim world, this is the way they make the grave. So whenever somebody passes by a place like this, they know that this is a grave, somebody is buried there. And this is the opinion of Abu Hanifa and Malik wa Ahmad wal-Muzani wa kathirun min al-Shafi'iyah. Many of the followers of Imam al-Shafi'i, in addition to Abu Hanifa and Malik and Imam Ahmad, this is their opinion. At-tasneem is their opinion. And the Imam al-Shafi'i ذهب إلى أن التسطيح أفضل. Imam al-Shafi'i said to flatten the grave is better. So what do we understand from this? Both options are okay. Both options, tasneem or tasṭīḥ, both of them are okay, inshallah. Now, تعليم القبر بعلامة, to put a sign that distinguishes that specific grave. So you know that this grave belongs to X or Y. Whatever this sign is, you can put, a stone, you can write a name of the person or anything that makes people know that this is the grave of X or Y. So the scholar said that يجوز وضع على القبر علامة. It is permissible to put a sign that makes that grave known, whether it is from hajar, a stone, or khashab, a wood, or anything that can distinguish that grave. And this is based on the hadith that was narrated by Ibn Majah عن أنس أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أعلم قبر عثمان بن مضعون بصخرة, that the Prophet ﷺ put a stone on the grave of Uthman ibn Mad'un to distinguish that grave because it was by itself in an isolated area. And also hadith al-Muttalib ibn Abi Wada'ah, وفيه, in this hadith, أنه حمل الصخرة فوضعها عند رأسه, that the Prophet ﷺ carried the stone and put it next to where the head of the body was. وقال أتعلم بها قبر أخي وأدفن إليها من مات من أهلي. So it's not the Prophet ﷺ, someone from the family of Uthman ibn Mad'un. He said, this is to distinguish the brother of the grave of my brother, and to bury my family members around this grave. وفي الحديث استحباب, and in this hadith there is an indication that it is recommended, مستحب, جمع الموتى الأقارب في أماكن متجاورة, to bury the people from the same family in the same area. In the same area. Why? لأنه أيسر لزيارتهم وأكثر للترحم عليهم. So it is easier for their family members to, when they visit them, so all the graves of the family members will be in the same area, so they can visit them and make dua for them. Now, خلع النعال في المقابر. خلع النعال. النعال, shoes. What is the hukm of taking off the shoes in the graveyard when you enter the graveyard? Maybe you have noticed that, whenever there is a burial, some of the brothers, or one or two, or some of them, they take off their shoes. The majority of the scholars, ذهب أكثر أهل العلم إلى أنه لا بأس بالمشي في المقابر بالنعال. It is permissible to walk inside the cemetery, the graveyard, while wearing your shoes. You don't have to take off your shoes. You don't have to take off your shoes. Jarir ibn Hazim rahimahullah said, رأيت الحسن وابن سيرين يمشيان بين القبور بنعالهما. I've seen Al-Hasan and Ibn Sirin, Al-Hasan al-Basri and Ibn Sirin, and both of them are among the scholars of the Tabi'een. I've seen them walking with their shoes in the graveyard. There is hadith of Imam al-Bukhari and Muslim and Abu Dawud wa Nasa'i عن أنس رضي الله عنه, that the Prophet ﷺ said, أنه قال إن العبد إذا وضع في قبره وتولى أصحابه إنه ليسمع قرع نعالهم. This is a very well-known hadith when the Prophet ﷺ talked about when the person is buried in the grave, and then whenever the people finish the burial and they start walking out of the cemetery, he said, the deceased person in his grave, إنه لا يسمع قرع نعالهم. He hears the steps of their shoes. He hears the steps of their shoes. So the scholar said, استدل العلماء, this is an evidence taken by the scholars, that it is okay to walk in the graveyard in your shoes. It is okay to walk in your shoes. وكره الإمام أحمد المشي بالنعال السبتية في المقابر. ما معنى النعال? What did he mean by the النعال? النعال السبتية. النعال السبتية was a specific type of shoes that rich people used to wear at that time. Rich people used to wear at that time. I don't know what's the equivalent of this kind of shoes nowadays, Calvin Klein or whatever. I mean, anything that you know, people usually wear in parties and weddings and all that stuff. Why? Because he said that the graveyard is a place where we remember death, where we remember al-akhirah. So it is not permissible to wear something that is expensive, that people, only rich people, wealthy people can afford. So it's not haram, but it is not recommended because it contradicts with the purpose of being in the graveyard. You see? So it doesn't mean that all the shoes are prohibited, but specific type of shoes at that time. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw somebody in the graveyard wearing those shoes, the Prophet ﷺ asked him not to wear them. So the Sahabi took them off and threw them away when the Prophet ﷺ made this comment to him. قال الخطابي يشبه أن يكون إنما كره ذلك لما فيه من الخيلاء. خيلاء means to show off that you are wealthy and you can afford this type of shoes. And they said, for those who would like to take off their shoes out of respect to the dead people, this is, you know, they can do so, but if they are afraid of any harm that might happen to them, you know, anything on the ground that might hurt the person, then it is better to wear your shoes in the graveyard. It is better to wear your shoes in the graveyard. So this is about, you know, walking in the graveyard while wearing the shoes. Now, النهي عن ستر القبور. Sitr, which means to cover the grave. People in al-Jahiliyyah, they used to cover the grave with any type of fabric. And people used to take this as a means of showing off. Like, you know, a family or a tribe, they bury somebody from that tribe, and his family, you know, to show off, to show that they are wealthy and they can afford, you know, a lot of stuff, they go and get maybe the most expensive piece of fabric, let's say silk or something like this, and they put it on the grave, just to show that, you know, we can take care of, you know, our... So the Prophet ﷺ prohibited that. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited that. And again, the reason is we shouldn't do anything that does not, excuse me, we shouldn't do anything that does not benefit the deceased person. What does that cover, that piece of fabric, benefit? What does it do to benefit the person? So Islam always focuses on doing things that will benefit the person who is in the grave, number one. Number two, Islam prohibits spending money on things that has no significance. So instead of getting that cover, and whether it's expensive or not, take that money and give it sadaqah on behalf of the person. It will be much beneficial for that person than doing that. So that's why Islam prohibited covering the grave. Now, تحريم المساجد والسرج على المقابر. The prohibition of building a masjid on a grave and putting lights inside that place or inside the grave, like building a dome, ضريح, a shrine, and putting the lights inside. This is prohibited in Islam. It is not permissible in Islam to go to you know, a grave, or, you know, unfortunately this is very well spread in the Muslim world. When somebody, a righteous person, dies, they go to his grave and they build a building, okay? And they put the lights inside, and then people start going there and visiting, and, you know, and asking the dead person what they are supposed to ask from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is prohibited. And this is very well, there are so many ahadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, قَاتَلَ اللَّهُ الْيَهُودِ اتَّخَذُوا قُبُورَ أَنْبِيَائِهِمْ مَسَاجِدِ. The Prophet ﷺ cursed the people of the book because they have taken the graves of their prophets as masajid. لعن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم زائرات القبور والمتخذين عليها المساجد والسرج. The Prophet ﷺ cursed those who visit the graves and taking or building rooms and masajid and putting lights inside and all that stuff. So there are so many ahadith where the Prophet ﷺ prohibited this, and he cursed the people who did this. كراهية الذبح عند القبر. It is makruh, dislike to slaughter a sacrifice on a grave or next to a grave. Of course, here with the intention of offering that sacrifice for the person who is in the grave, or as they used to do in al-Jahiliyyah. In the time of Jahiliyyah, they used to go to the grave of a person who used to be generous, okay? And slaughter a camel there or whatever, a sheep or a goat or a cow or whatever, and saying that as he used to be generous in his life, let him be generous in his grave. And they leave the animal sacrificed over there for the wild animals and the birds to come and eat it. Subhanallah. They said, he was generous with people in his life, and he is still generous with the animals after his death. So this is prohibited in Islam, to go to the grave and slaughter or sacrifice an animal over there. It used to be something from al-Jahiliyyah. The Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, لا عقر في الإسلام. Al-aqr, which means slaughtering or sacrificing a camel. In Islam, it is not prohibited to do it next to the grave. Imam al-Khattabi rahmatullahi alayhi said, كان أهل الجاهلية يعقرون الإبل على قبر الرجل الجواد. The people of Jahiliyyah used to slaughter, to sacrifice the camel on the grave of the generous person. يقولون نجازيه على فعله. We reward him for what he used to be or what he used to do in his life for being generous with people, so we are rewarding him now. So this is something prohibited in Islam. النهي عن الجلوس على القبر والاستناد عليه والمشي عليه. The prohibition of sitting on the grave, laying down on the grave, or walking on the grave. This is something debatable among scholars. There are some who said it is prohibited, and there are those who said it is makruh, disliked, and there are those who said it is permissible, especially if there is no way to arrive to go to a grave except that you step on other graves. Now, our situation here in our graves, whatever grave, Greenwood or La Vista Memorial or Mount Hope, the cemetery or the burial nowadays here is a business. So if you look at the plan of the grave, okay, the blueprint of the graveyard, they don't leave between the grave and the grave except, I would say, 2 or 3 inches. Okay? The space to put a cement box next to that. And they bury the person. The next grave is away like a few inches. Why? Again, because they want to use every single inch from the ground, because it's a business. Now you go to the graveyard and you try not to step on the grave. It's impossible. It is impossible. That's why we don't recommend, when people bury somebody in the graveyard here, to put any small fence like this or stones, or people are going to step there anyway. Even the truck that dig the grave, runs over the graves that already exist over there. So in this case, there is nothing wrong. It is permissible to step on the grave if this is the only way that you can go to another grave or to walk around or to move over there. And again, we don't have any choice, we don't have any other option but to step on the graves, as it says, كما اتفقوا على جواز المشي على القبور إذا كان هناك ضرورة تدعو إليه كما إذا لم يصل إلى قبر ميته إلا بذلك. So it is permissible if there is no other option. But if there is an option and you have walkways between the graves, then it is prohibited just to walk on the grave on purpose, for no reason, just to walk on the grave. This is prohibited. When it comes to sitting on the grave, there is debatable, this is debatable issue among scholars. There are those who said it is prohibited because of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and there are those who said, no, the hadith doesn't mean it's prohibited, it is makruh, karaha tanzihiyya, karaha which is close to al-halal than to al-haram. There are two types of karaha. Karaha tahrimiyya, which is makruh, close to al-haram, and there is karaha tanzihiyya, makruh, close to al-halal. They said the hadith means that it is makruh, karaha tanzihiyya, and not karaha tahrimiyya. So it is not prohibited to sit on the grave. And there are those who said it is permissible to sit on the grave. It is permissible to sit on the grave. النهي عن تجصيص القبر والكتابة عليه. تجصيص, the prohibition of تجصيص means to paint. You make the grave, you put like stones around the grave and the dirt like in a pyramid shape, as I have mentioned, and then you come and paint the stones around the grave. They said it is prohibited. Why it is prohibited? Again, because you are doing too much things to the grave. You are trying to make the grave look nice, look beautiful. Islam doesn't care about this kind of stuff. Islam cares more about what you are doing to benefit the person who is inside the grave. The dua that you are making, the sadaqah that you are making, make hajj on his behalf, make umrah on his behalf. This is what we should focus on. So Islam, there is this principle in Islam called saddu dhari'ah. Saddu dhari'ah means something that might not be prohibited in itself, but it might lead later on to something else that is strictly prohibited. So people might start by just painting the stones, but later on they start competing. He painted the stones of the grave of his dad. So I'm going to build something with marble, to look better. And someone else said, I'm going to build like actually a building, like a room to look from far away, like a fancy. And so, because this is how the haram starts. This is how the deviation starts. The deviation doesn't start haram from day one. No, people start taking things easy, things that might be makruh, disliked, and they take it easy, and step by step, they will fall in something that is strictly haram. So Islam cuts that from the first place, from the first step. Don't do it. Because if you do it now, someone else will do something more than that, and someone else might do something more than the second one, and people will go that way. Now, when it comes to al-kitaba, to writing, just to summarize what the scholars said, some of the scholars, they said writing anything is prohibited. Some of them, they said writing al-Quran is prohibited. And we have seen here sometimes people, they put a big, stone on the grave and they write Quran. And people come and step on it. So they said writing Quran is prohibited. But writing the name of the person is not prohibited. And one of the scholars mentioned that many of scholars, throughout generations, they allowed to write their names so their graves will be distinguished. When people go to the graveyard, they make dua for them. You see? And some of the scholars, they said actually it is better if somebody like a scholar, somebody righteous, somebody who is very well known in the community, to write his name or her name on the like a piece of wood or a stone. And Imam Ibn Hazm rahimahullah, he said, I like engraving the name on a stone. He said, I like engraving the name on a stone and to put the stone on the grave so people know who is this person, especially if this person is a righteous person or scholar or something like this. So different opinions of scholars. And again, let me go back and remind you that the purpose of this hesitation and disagreement is that scholars don't want to allow people to go further in that route. Now they are, writing their name, and tomorrow they will be writing Quran, and I don't know, Allahu Alam, what they will be writing, down the road. So they don't want people to go beyond what is permissible and not to give a lot of importance to the look of the grave, but to do what will benefit the person. Now, at-tin, the clay, they put the stones, and they are afraid that the stones will move or something like this. They put at-tin, the clay, which is, like cement, for example. So they said it is permissible to put at-tin, the clay, between the stones to keep the stones together and they don't move in, whenever there is like a heavy rain or something like this. So it is permissible to put at-tin. وَلَا بَأْسَ بِتَطْيِينِ الْقَبْرِ. It is permissible. There is nothing wrong. قال الإمام الترمذي وقد رخص بعض أهل العلم منهم الحسن البصري في تطيين القبور. Some of the scholars, one of them is Imam Hassane al-Basri, one of the great of the Tabi'een. وقال الإمام الشافعي لا بأس بأن يطين القبر. Imam Shafi'i said, there is nothing wrong to put a tin to keep the stones around al-qabr. دفن أكثر من واحد في القبر. To bury more than one body in the same graves, the same grave. So our scholars, since the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they allowed only one body in the grave, one body in the grave, except if there is an exception. What is the exception? We have something that happened, a natural disaster, an earthquake, whatever happened, and there are so many deaths, and we can't have a grave for each body. In this case, they allowed to put more than one body in a grave. Or a lot of people died and we don't have that many people to dig the graves. They said, in this case also, we can put more one body. Based on what? Based on what happened after the Battle of Badr. The Sahaba came to the Prophet ﷺ, how many Sahabi died was killed as Shaheed in Badr? 70. So the Sahaba, after the Battle of Badr, many of them were injured and they were exhausted. They were injured and they were exhausted. So they came to the Prophet ﷺ and told him, Ya Rasulullah, we cannot have a grave for each one. What should we do? He said, dig deep and make it wide and put several in one grave, several Sahaba in one grave. And start with the one who memorizes Quran more than the other, subhanAllah, to give the preference to the people of Al-Quran. You see? So based on that, that's why when you go, by the way, to Uhud, to the graveyard of Shuhada in Uhud, of course there is a fence. When you look inside, you don't see graves for each one of them. There are two big squares. There are two inside the graveyard. There are two big squares next to each other. So this is how the Sahaba were buried, the Shuhada of Uhud were buried over there. So based on that, the scholars said that it is preferable to have one body in one grave. But if under specific circumstances, like a lot of people or something like this, then we can put more than one in one grave, as long as it can fit more than one. So this is what we have for tonight, and inshallah next time we'll continue. There are so many things that we will talk about again, about the permissibility of as we have seen, burying more than one body in a grave and all that stuff. People who died, for example, in the ocean, what should we do, and all that stuff. So next time, inshallah, we'll continue. Until then, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our knowledge. وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to turn this knowledge into action, into al-amal. Because knowledge without action doesn't benefit. Knowledge without action doesn't benefit. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our knowledge, to help us to turn our knowledge into action. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from us everything good we have done in our lives and to forgive us for our mistakes and shortcomings. نسأل الله تبارك وتعالى أن يجعلنا وإياكم من الذين يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم اغفر لنا يا رب العالمين واحفظنا بما تحفظ به عبادك الصالحين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خير وبارك الله فيكم وإياكم. Yes, go ahead. وإياكم.
Permissible to kill your shoe when walking?